Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. I'm Zach Ewing, joined today by advocate LSU baseball beat writer Koki Riley. And that's right, it is February, and I'm in New Orleans for Super Bowl week, but it is almost baseball season, strangely. And it probably doesn't to you, Koki, because you've got to think about it, and it's your job and everything. Like you're counting down the days, and you've got deadlines and all these things. But it always sneaks up on me that you're like, happy Valentine's Day, have a king cake, and by the way, we're playing baseball next week.
Yeah, it's a pretty wonderful time of year, Zach. I've been looking forward to it really since the end of last season when it all came, for lack of a better word, crashing down unexpectedly in the ninth inning against UNC in the Chapel Hill Regional. But really, like it's like here we are, we're here, we're now as we're recording this 10 days away from the start of the season, and I'm just really excited for it.
Yeah, as Koki said, we are recording this on Tuesday, probably going to air it, I don't know, Thursday. You'll know when we air it before we do right now. And this is part one of our two-part LSU baseball preview. Part two is going to come your way next week, probably pretty close to opening night. We might try to sneak a basketball pod in between, but part two will be next week. Opening night is Valentine's Day, February the 14th, and it is against IPFW. And if you know what that stands for, then you're a big college sports fan. Congratulations. That is Indiana, Purdue, Fort Wayne. The Mastodons, I believe. So LSU will probably masticate the Mastodons, chew them up and spit them out. Sorry for that vocab joke there, but it's been pretty typical of Jay Johnson's Tigers to open with one of these series where they can kind of dip their toe in the water.
Yeah, usually the non-conference slate for LSU, at least under Jay Johnson, has been a lot of series where you're just trying to get your footing and trying to get some games in before the real bullets start flying in mid-March and you get into conference play. There's usually one weekend, and this year is no exception to that, or a game here or a game there where they're going to play a team that has a really good shot at making it to the tournament, let alone and potentially even making it to Omaha. This year they're playing Kansas State and Nebraska. Nebraska made, I believe, a super regional last year. Kansas State took down Arkansas in their own regional. So those aren't going to be necessarily easy games. They're playing both those teams in Frisco for a little weekend tournament. And then they're also playing DBU in Dallas a few days before that in a midweek game. So those are going to be their few, I guess, real tests in non-conference play before we get to conference play where they get a really tough schedule. But we'll save that conversation for later.
Yeah, we're going to talk part two of this podcast is going to be going a little bit more through the schedule and maybe talking about if expectations for this program, which are always high, but are they reasonable at number 2 in the country? And like, you're going to make Omaha. But yeah, to your point, they have those games against Nebraska and K-State and Dallas Baptist. Outside of that, it's IPFW, Southern, Nichols. Strange twist, they bring Omaha here instead of going to Omaha. Omaha comes here. You've also got Sam Houston, who's usually got a pretty good program, North Dakota State, North Alabama. And then all of a sudden you're in conference play. They play Xavier. And then open conference play against Missouri in early March. So we'll talk more about the schedule and how it breaks down and maybe some more specific predictions in part 2 of this preview next week. But for now, we're going to kind of do a roster breakdown because college baseball has always been a lot of roster turnover between the draft and, bringing in freshmen who are going to have to play. You just have a lot of holes on a lot of college baseball teams. But in the era of the transfer portal, as with many other college sports, it is just hit another level. I mean, like there's turnover everywhere. And for LSU, for a program like LSU and for Jay Johnson, that means they've brought in an awful lot of talent. And we should say, first off, Koki, LSU fans, if you haven't already, go back a couple weeks, look back through the podcast feed on the LSU Tigers on NOLA.com YouTube channel. In fact, I'll put the link in the description of our conversation with Jay Johnson from about 3 weeks ago. where Jay breaks down a lot of the newcomers. He talks about his roster. He talks about his expectations. He was able to join us, and we're grateful for that for like 40 minutes. And so it's a nice long conversation, and I'll put the link to that in. But ultimately, like I feel like, and this is one reason why LSU is number 2 in the country in some polls like Baseball America. It's a nice mix of newcomers and guys who came back after having good years last year.
Yeah, you just pulled up the pitching, the starting rotation, uh, little banner there, and pitching wise, it's a lot of new faces. I mean, it's 12 of the top 14 pitchers last year in terms of innings pitched are not back from last season. They're only bringing back 2 of those guys. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it just shows how much turnover they've had. A lot of transfers, a lot of incoming freshmen. They did an exceptional job of bringing in, of maintaining a lot of the freshman talent that they had signed to the program, keeping those guys, letting them survive through the draft, I guess you could say. And then offensively, though, I think that's where a lot of the returners are. They have 6 returning starters, and a guy like Ethan Fry, for example, who isn't, I don't know if you can say is a starter, but he contributed a bit last season. So that's really like 6 or 7 contributors on the offensive side of the ball, which is not what they had last year. So it's a little bit of the opposite of last season, where last season it was a lot of guys who didn't contribute a ton having to take that step forward, talented guys, but needing to take that step forward to contribute last season. This year, it's more of new pitchers and just new bodies, whether it's freshmen or transfers. So we can break it down more specifically here, but that's just sort of like the outlay of the land in terms of what's new, what's not. 6 returning starters on offense, 7 real contributors, I would say, and then on the pitching side, really, I like Kade Anderson and Gavin Guidry are really the only guys who were major contributors to last year's staff who are back. Everybody else is new, so it's a lot to break down. It's the best way
Yeah,
to say it.
yeah. Well, let's get started with the rotation. I think the guy you mentioned, Kade Anderson, is probably where you start here. Kade Anderson is a draft eligible sophomore, correct? So he
Yes.
is probably going to be drafted pretty highly next summer. He is a lefty. He is, as I said, a sophomore who had a pretty good freshman season. Pitched quite a bit. He appeared in 18 games. 9 of them were starts. He had 38 innings, a 3.99 ERA, 59 strikeouts in those 38 innings. He did walk 20 guys, so maybe a little higher than you'd like there. But this is the year they kind of expect Anderson to take the leap. And I mean, is it fair to say they expect him to become the Friday night guy by the time SEC play rolls around?
I don't know if they expect him to become the Friday night guy, but my expectation is that he will be the Friday night guy, or at least the Saturday night guy. Just given the way he's pitched, whether it was in the fall or this preseason, where he's been really dominant at times. I mean, I'm just remembering from this past weekend in the scrimmages, he pitched 5 innings, gave up 1 hit, and had a bunch of strikeouts, and that's against some pretty good hitters on this LSU team. And he's added a pretty sharp slider to that really good curveball he already has. His fastball's ticked up a little bit more. Mechanically, he's always been really excellent. And now that he's 2 years removed from his Tommy John surgery, he's fully ready to go and really firing in all cylinders, because he didn't pitch a senior year of high school because of Tommy John. He had that surgery when he was a junior, and it was one of the main reasons why he was even able to get to school in the first place. And last year was a pretty good year considering the fact that he didn't really have a senior year of high school. And there were some downs, like the middle of the year he kind of struggled, but by the end of the year he was a pretty key reliever for them and pitching some big innings in the Chapel Hill Regional. But this season it really seems like he's taken a step forward, whether it's with his command, a couple ticks extra on his fastball, or it's adding a bullet slider to the curveball that he already has. And he also has a changeup, so it's like 4 strong pitches, 2 excellent ones, a third pitch that's really emerging lately. I talked to one scout who was like the slider was amazing when they saw it pitch last Friday, and I'm the most confident in him out of all the potential starters for this team heading into this season.
Yeah. After that, it gets a little murkier. Speaking of Tommy John surgery, Chase Shores was off to a promising start in his LSU career 2 seasons ago. He had given up 4 runs, struck out 15 in 18 innings pitched, ERA sub 2, all that kind of stuff. And then he blew out his elbow, needed Tommy John surgery, and missed the rest of that season and missed all of last season. So he is back and fully healthy. Is he a guy that you expect to join Anderson in the weekend rotation? And who else is in that mix?
I think at least to start the season, I would expect Shores to be a starter just because he'll know when he's going to pitch. He'll have all the time in the world to warm up before ahead of his starts. Like it's just a lot easier for him to ease into being a pitcher again and having to pitch against live hitters again when you're kind of given that starting role. And there's a couple ways this could go. This could take, months, if not the entire season, for him to get back to where he was pre-injury, or it could be more like the Gage Jump situation where he kind of hit the ground running a little bit. And I think Jump I think he came in as a reliever for like 1 inning and then slowly worked up his count to the point where by the end, at least by the end of non-conference play, he was fully ready to go. That was a similar situation where Jump hadn't pitched in a year and a half when they brought him in. And then by the end of the year, he's one of the better starters in the country. So if that ends up being the case, they're going to be more than fine. And even if that isn't the
almost
case,
2 years. It's March 31st of 23, the last time he pitched.
Yeah. It was a relief appearance against Tennessee where he was pumping in 100 miles an hour because that's the sort of talent this guy has. He's 6'9". He throws up to 100 miles an hour. It has a really good slider that's actually looked really good in the preseason, which is a good sign, given that sometimes breaking pitches, it takes a while for you to regain that feel after Tommy John surgery. And we already know he has a pretty good changeup. So it's 3 pitches, it's 6'9", it's 100 miles an hour with movement. And I think the thing I want to see from him as we get into the regular season is just developing that consistency, whether it's with his command. His command's been a little bit off during the preseason, or it's with just, to me, honestly, it's most of the command and getting that fastball velocity back up again. He's sitting more around 93, 95 this preseason. I'd like to see him get more up into the upper 90s where he's really just letting it go, because we know he has it in him. I mean, we saw it 2 years ago. So just more innings and just getting more comfortable with his body again after such a major injury, obviously.
Mm-hmm. And beyond those 2 guys, who do you expect to kind of fill out this rotation or at least get a chance to do that for LSU?
Yeah, I'd say there's 2 guys for the last spot at the moment. And there's some other candidates. Like Jay has talked about how they've stretched out 8 guys to pitch to be in multiple inning roles. So there's a chance that it's William Schmidt. There's a chance that it's Kason Evans. There's even a chance that it's Gavin Guidry. I don't expect that to happen. The 2 guys that I'm kind of eyeing right now, it's Connor Ware. Who's a left-handed pitcher, junior college transfer. Another mid to low 90s fastball, has really good feel for his stuff. Mostly throws strikes. And this is a guy who had a sub-2 ERA in 2 seasons in junior college ball, but he barely pitched in junior college ball, mostly because of injuries. So he's a bit of a question mark in terms of can he stay healthy throughout an entire season? What's his workload going to look like? But just in terms of stuff and ability, like this is a guy who, I mean, I've talked with a scout or 2 about this, where they thought that he would have been drafted this past year if he had been healthy through junior college ball. Like he has that much ability. It's just a matter of he came to LSU because it doesn't hurt to pitch against SEC pitching for a year, SEC hitting for a year, and it would also just be helpful to get some more innings underneath this belt and just more of a sample size for teams. So I think those were 2 big factors as to why he's here in the first place. And that's a huge benefit for LSU because potentially he could be in the Griffin Herring role that we saw that Herring was so good in last season, multi-inning reliever in big spots, or he could be a starter. So I think that's a big addition, especially as a left-handed pitcher, because they don't have a ton of lefties on this team, unlike last year. And then the other candidate for the spot's Anthony Ianson. He's a right-handed pitcher from UC San Diego. Another guy pitched for Team USA last season, had some really good numbers for them. fastball that can reach in the mid 90s, multiple breaking pitches. They have options in this rotation, and we've been talking about and screaming about how this team needs that Sunday starter for the last few years, and maybe this is the year where they finally have not just one answer, but potentially multiple answers for that last spot in the rotation.
Yeah, and I'll say this, you mentioned the sort of the tantalizing upside of Connor Ware, kid from Madisonville, or I'm sorry, not Madison. That's where Anderson's from, but from just Madison, Mississippi, Pearl River Community College, great stuff, great stats. He's only thrown 32 innings over 2 years in junior
Yeah.
college. That's where Ianson kind of has this. He threw 82 innings last year. He was among the nation's leaders in a lot of different counting stats at UC San Diego. Like, he's rock solid. You talk about innings eaters, and it's kind of become this cliche, but like, if you have a couple of guys coming off of Tommy John and Anderson and Shores, and another guy who's had his own injury history in Connor Ware, having an innings eater is probably a really good thing to have.
Yeah. And that's where I think it's fair to mention a guy like Zach Cowan, who is going to have that length role. He's one of the 8 guys that I mentioned earlier, in terms of guys who are going to be in these multi-inning roles. And Cowan's the guy who pitched 110 innings last season for Wofford. I think at one point during their conference tournament for Wofford last season, he had like 2 starts in like 4 days, something insane like that, which is almost reckless. But this is a guy who has 4 pitches, all for strikes. Doesn't really light up the radar gun really. He was really around like 88 to 90 miles an hour with his fastball, but the pitch moves. Pitch has a little bit of movement to it, and everything's a strike. And he was always around the zone, and I just feel like that's a guy who is going to be kind of the classic innings eater for them. If something doesn't go right at the beginning of the game, they can just put in Cowan, and he's going to be reliable. You know exactly what you're going to get for 4 or 5 innings. Just let him rip. And I think he should be mentioned if we're talking about innings eater at any point, any innings eaters at any point. And I think you make a great point about Ianson in terms of his reliability. And and it's not like he has a low ceiling or anything. I mean, this is a guy who
No.
has the stuff to be an SEC starting pitcher. It's just that Connor Ware, on the flip side, Jay Johnson has said that he was the best pitcher they had in the fall on the whole team, and that means something when it's coming out of his mouth. So if you keep that in mind, and you keep in mind all the other aspects of this team, it's kind of hard to pick out who that last starter is going to be, or really who the 3 starters are going to be in general. So they just have a lot of depth, and I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, and obviously that comes in very handy, not only in SEC play, but come postseason time too. So one of the guys you briefly mentioned kind of leads our discussion about the bullpen as we shift into that, and that's Gavin Guidry. And he has kind of filled multiple roles in his career at LSU. I mean, he's been a closer. He's been kind of the fireman, long guy out of the bullpen. I think he's even started a couple of games. But where do you see them using Gavin Guidry? Jay Johnson said he was stretched out. He could start, I suppose, but he's really kind of fit into this role as, like I said, the fireman who we saw him do it in the Chapel Hill Regional last year, where he comes in and gets LSU out of a big jam, and is the guy that they count on to get those. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6 outs in a key spot.
Yeah, and I wrote about him actually, what was it, a week ago now, a week or 2 ago, and he talked a lot about how the preparation he went through this offseason to sort of stretch out his role, because he had never pitched more than 3 1/3 innings until one relief appearance against I believe it was Northwestern State last year, when he had to go 4 innings in a game that they had to win. And I think they're down 5-2. He pitched 4 shutout innings in relief, and they ended up winning the game 6-5 in a season where they couldn't afford any more losses because of the really tough start they had gotten off in SEC play. So this is a guy who I think they want to pitch him more multiple times in the weekend. I think they want to pitch him in longer spurts out of the bullpen if needed. They need more Griffin Herring types. Like last year, they had Griffin Herring, and that was it in terms of like reliable relievers who could go multiple innings. I think Nate Ackenhausen was another guy who at least they thought could do that, but there were times where even he struggled after having a very promising first season with LSU. So I think this year they really want to have multiple dudes that they can rely on to pitch 2, 3, even 4 innings out of the bullpen, and be a bridge to a tough start from one of the starters, or you have a 1-run lead in the 6th inning, and you have a guy who can uh, just mow down hitters for the next 3 or 4 innings, and you win the game by 2. Like that's kind of that's what they're kind of looking for in a guy like Gavin. And there's a bunch of other candidates for that too. We could talk about those guys as well, but that's what Gavin couldn't really quite do the last few years. He had a few multi-inning relief appearances, but they're mostly just 2 innings. And they didn't really have too many options where you could pitch a guy 2 innings on Friday, and then he comes back and pitches an inning on Sunday. And just having that versatility to go to a guy for multiple innings, especially someone as valuable as Gavin and someone as experienced as Gavin, because he's now the most experienced guy of this bullpen. It's a very valuable thing to have. And this is a guy who can throw strikes, doesn't really light up the radar gun necessarily, but has one of the better sliders probably in all of college baseball, has added a curveball, has added a pretty good changeup to go along with that as well. So it's expanding the repertoire with his pitches, it's lengthening him out and giving him the stamina to go multiple innings. It's both of those things combined in terms of the keys to turn him into sort of like a multi-inning weapon for them, whether it's at bullpen or even potentially as a starter.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of other guys who, probably play a major role in this bullpen in Zach Cowan and William Schmidt, but there's other names too. And I want to go through a couple of those, but I will say this, Koki, this is probably of the 3 kind of areas we split this into: rotation, bullpen, and then the lineup. This is the most uncertain. Like, this is the one that Jay has to, kind of see how the pieces fit through February and probably even March and into April before he decides exactly how he deploys these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have a lot of options though. A lot of guys who could be pretty darn good, depending on how they're deployed. I talked about Cowan at length already. I think he's going to be a pretty important piece of this bullpen and even a potential starter for them. And then there's the freshmen like William Schmidt, Maverick Rizzi, Casey Evans. Evans and Schmidt have been extended, as I mentioned earlier. Schmidt, as almost everybody knows, was supposed to be a first-round pick, a guy who would have been one of the first 2 or 3 right-handed pitchers picked in the MLB draft. But then at the very last second, literally at the very last second, he takes his name out of the draft essentially, and decides to come to LSU, turning down what I would almost say certainly turned down millions of dollars to come to Baton Rouge. And that was just an absolutely massive thing for the future of this program. And obviously, but it's also something that's going to help him this season, because this guy probably has one of the best curveballs in the world for pitchers who are under, let's say, 23, 22 years old, because it is a ridiculous pitch after having seen it a couple times now through the fall and the preseason. And then compare that with a fastball, it's around 95, 96 miles an hour, a developing changeup, even a little bit of a slider. Like, he is the full package, and he throws strikes. So he's a very, very exciting player. And Casey Evans is a little bit less known, came in as a two-way player, but they've pretty much cut out the hitting part of his game. And he's exciting too, because his fastball was up to 99 miles an hour in the fall. So it's another very talented freshman to go along with a third guy in Maverick Rizzi, who there's really 4 of them, but these 3 are righties. Maverick Rizzi, kid from Massachusetts, 6'9", tumbling fastball that's up to 95, 96 miles an hour, and a pretty good slider as well. He's not going to be as much in an extend role, because I think he's a little bit more raw than those other guys. Not necessarily because of the strikes, but mostly because of the lack of a third pitch. But he's very, very talented. I think he's going to play a role in, short-term relief, inning here, inning there sort of guy. And then Cooper Williams is the 4th freshman. He's a left-handed pitcher. That's why I think he's going to get quite a bit of run on this team. They don't have a ton of lefties. They kind of picked him up at the last second. He was committed to Texas A&M. Then the whole coaching debacle happened there, so he decommitted from Texas A&M. They got him to the draft. Then they got him to commit to LSU. So those 4 freshmen are guys to watch out for, to go along with Guidry, to go along with Cowan, and potentially either Ianson or Ware. So now you're kind of seeing how deep this bullpen could be. And I haven't even mentioned a guy like Connor Benge, who has looked pretty good in the fall. It transferred out of Dallas Baptist. So yeah, they just have a ton of options. I mean, Jacob Myers is another guy, Nicholls State transfer, who can strike out guys with his eyes closed because his fastball is just so good. The problem with him, the question with him, I should say, is more of his control. And they have a couple of guys like that, big arsenals in terms of their talent. Jaden Newt's another one. Jaden Newt's another guy, returning player, but he's only pitched an inning mostly because of injuries, Tommy John surgery primarily. So they have a ton of different options out of this bullpen. It's just a matter of who fits into what roles. And I think the most exciting part about it is that most of these guys are going to be throwing can at least throw 3 or 4 innings out of the bullpen. So you just have a lot more length there. And with that length combined with the depth, now you're talking about like a really well-rounded bullpen that can really help you out, not just in SEC play, but once you get into the postseason, especially when the games are coming fast and furious.
Yeah, no doubt. The best thing about Maverick Rizzi, by the way, is not his spectacular name, but it is the fact that he is from Koki Riley's home state of Massachusetts.
Yes.
So we need to mention that as well. In fact, we might need to get a bell for the podcast and ding it every time that we mention that Maverick Rizzi is from Massachusetts. But I'm with you. I'm excited to see William Schmidt in that curveball. He's a Catholic high kid out of Baton Rouge. And so anybody who follows prep baseball in the area is already well familiar with it. But it's going to be fun, man, to watch some knees buckle with that thing.
Yeah, and he buckled Michael Braswell's knees on a curveball this past Saturday, and it was unbelievable. It was just like Michael Braswell, 4-year SEC player, and he just made him look silly. Nothing to do with Michael Braswell or to be concerned about him, but
he's going to do that too.
He can do that to everybody. He's just that talented, and the guy just screams talent. And unlike the Cam Johnson situation last year, where he was a very talented lefty in his own right, could have gone in the first 2 rounds in his own right, but the strikes were kind of an issue with him last year, right? And this year I don't really see that problem with Schmidt as much this season. He might leave a couple fastballs over the plate that turn to home runs, since there's not a ton of movement with that pitch. But the talent is still undeniable. Like, the guy it's very impressive. It's really, really impressive to watch.
Yeah, that'll definitely be a storyline worth watching. Okay, gonna transition into the lineup now, and we've got a picture of Stephen Malam down there, who hit the big home run against, was it Wofford? He hit the home run against at the regional.
Yeah, and then he hit the home run against South Carolina before that. So it was like 2 walk-off home runs in 3 games, which I think that was like a record at the time or something along the lines of that. Yeah,
he's back. Jared Jones is back, who's had a really good season last year. And then you kind of have like Tommy White's not here anymore. I mean, you kind of have a lot of newcomers. Guy I'm excited to see is Daniel Dickinson, who's a transfer. I don't know. With Jay Johnson, you never really get too concerned about the offense. He always seems to make it work. But there are a lot of new pieces here.
Yes. There are a lot of new pieces, but there's also 6 returning starters. And what that means is that they just have a lot more depth. And depth is kind of a calling card, and depth and versatility are kind of the calling cards of the offense this year. Not as much with the star power, which is, I think, what you're kind of putting your finger on. And I'll sort of get to the potential concerns with it. But just sort of introduce some, I guess, key names here who are new. Daniel Dickinson, as you mentioned, I believe he was a 3rd-team All-American last season, Utah Valley State transfer. They tried him out on the left side of the infield, but I think he's going to be the second baseman. I almost know for sure he's going to be the second baseman this season. So he's going to be a potential, I guess, quote unquote, star piece. I think he's top 100 in LB.com's draft rankings. Kade Anderson, Chase Shores, and Connor Ware in those rankings as well. But okay.
While you're on Dickinson, I just want to, just for those who haven't heard, Utah Valley in 2 seasons. This is why he's number 2 in that transfer list. 369 batting average, 27 home runs, 95 RBIs, and a 457 on base percentage. Now, he's playing in the WAC, which is not only maybe a little bit lower level of competition, obviously a lot lower than the SEC, but also lots of altitude involved. Okay, so
Yeah.
you're playing west, you're playing in mountains, so you have to adjust those numbers a little bit. But the numbers are spectacular, and like the kid, if you just watch film, he looks like he can just flat out hit.
Yeah. He's a baller. That's kind of the best way to describe him. Like he's got some Dustin Pedroia, whatever sort of energy to go that he's got. Can steal some bases, has a little bit of pop, plays his butt off. Is a good defensive second baseman. Not a ton of power again, but someone who can put the bat and the ball. He kind of struggled in the Cape League this summer. I mean, that's wood bat, so it's an extra tough element. But like that was kind of an introduction to the sort of level of pitching he's going to be seeing in the SEC this year. So if he struggles to start SEC play, don't fret too much. Give him some time at least to let him sort of figure things out offensively when it comes to just the level of competition is to the moon. It's a big transition. It's going to be a pretty big transition for him. And for, frankly, a lot of these transfers, because they're coming from places that are not the SEC, with the exception of Chris Stanfield, who I'll talk about right now, transfer from Auburn, could be their potential starting center fielder, a guy who hasn't really hit the ball terribly well last 2 years, but they're making a lot of mechanical changes with him that they made with Michael Braswell last year that obviously really helped Braswell's offensive game, especially toward the end of the season. And I think you could see a similar thing here with Stanfield, because Stanfield's been hitting the ball pretty well in the preseason and with some power, which is something that we didn't really see from him in his first 2 years at Auburn. You have those 2 guys are probably, really have a really good shot of starting in day one as transfers that they brought in. A third guy would probably be Luis Hernandez, who's an Indiana State transfer, hit 23 home runs last season. He's from Puerto Rico. He's he's obviously has that power with 23 homers, and that could be a potential concern with his team is the lack of power that they have, at least compared to last season. But yeah, like I think those 3 guys are the transfers to look out for in terms of potential starters on day one. And then they have a couple more freshmen. Again, this team probably has the most talented freshman class in the country, because Derek Curiel and Kade Anderson were 2 guys who, if you told me a year ago they'd both be on this team, I would have not believed you, because I figured at least one of them would be off to Major League Baseball right now. They're that talented. And Anderson is a grown man already. He's big. He has a cannon of an arm. He can hit the ball out of the park. He's raw, which is part of the reason why he's at LSU in the first place. But defensively, he hasn't looked too bad behind the plate from at least what I've seen. And offensively, offensively, he looked a little bit more polished than I thought he looked too, and just in terms of like putting the ball in play and stuff like that. So you have him behind the plate as a potential option catcher to go along with Hernandez and Blaze Priester as a junior college transfer. That's sort of the catcher situation, because they have 4 brand new catchers this year, with Eddie Yaman being the 4th guy. He's a transfer from Dayton. And then the other freshman to really keep an eye out for in terms of early playing time is Derek Curiel, another center field type, really speedy guy. He was one of the 5 to 10, I guess, heading into last year's draft. If you looked at last year's draft, if you look this time a year ago, the best way to put this is like this time a year ago, he was probably one of the 5 to 10 most talented players in the country, just in terms of headline names from that incoming high school class. And then for whatever reason, Major League Baseball didn't like him as much. Maybe it had to do with the lack of power that he has. And now he's here at LSU. And you see the contact skills, you see the athleticism, the speed. He's not going to be perfect from day one. No freshman is, but he's already added 13 pounds from the fall and trying to add a little bit more strength and power to his game. But in terms of just like the raw athleticism and speed, like that's a guy who's going to be playing for this team early on. So those are a lot of the new guys to sort of keep an eye out for. And I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with Jake Brown. They're familiar with Ashton Larson, Josh Pearson. Stephen Milam's moving from second base to shortstop, something we talked about a lot with Jay Johnson on the podcast. And Michael Braswell, I think, will be moving to third base. They haven't finalized that yet. Just to be clear, Milam could be the third baseman. He could be the shortstop, but he's going to move to the left side of the infield either way. How they figure out what they're going to do between him and Braswell is going to be really, really interesting to sort of parse out. So, yeah, and obviously there's Jared Jones, who you mentioned earlier as well. So they just have a lot of different options, especially in that outfield in terms of who starts and who doesn't. And there's more versatility. There's more left-handed hitters, and it's going to be really, really interesting to keep an eye out for and see all the permutations of this team at the plate.
Yeah, the lack of star power is certainly one thing, but there's a lot of guys that who could become stars. Milam could become a star. Jared Jones take another step and become a star. Like Tommy White is gone, but that doesn't mean it just feels like a lineup that is not going to have a lot of holes in it. Now, I don't know if this is a fair concern or not. You tell me. With all these guys moving positions, and you've got a team that has been sort of up and down defensively in Jay Johnson's tenure here, do you think defense could be a concern for LSU?
I actually think the defense is probably going to take a step forward this season because they don't have I wouldn't say force, but they don't have to put Michael Braswell at shortstop like they did last season. He struggled at times defensively there. You put Milam at short, that could be an upgrade. You put Braswell at third, that could be an upgrade for Braswell because he could just be more comfortable playing that position. They have multiple options to play center field. And as long as those options can give them at least some offense, then they'll feel comfortable playing those guys where they get the offense and the defense, right? Because last year, like Paxton Kling was a great defensive option in center field, but he really struggled at the plate. So you had to sort of make that decision of, oh, should we play this guy out there? Mac Bingham struggled at the plate, and then there were times where he even struggled defensively in center field as well. And so you kind of had to put Jake Brown out there in center, and he was a guy who he's probably more comfortable playing that position now, but it wasn't a guarantee that things were going to work out perfectly there this year. But last year. So, but this season, you feel better about Brown as a potential center fielder. You feel better about Curiel as a potential center fielder because he's a natural center fielder who's shown that he can put the ball in play at the very least, if not do more. Then there's Stanfield, who has experience playing a center field in the SEC already and has improved. When we've seen the improvements he's made at the plate. So they have three potential center fielders. They're pretty strong up the middle defensively. Dickinson, the longtime second baseman, to go along with Milam, who Jay has said is their best defensive infielder, and I would agree with that. Then Braswell might be better off at third base anyway. So combine all that with a returning Jared Jones, and your really only real, I think, defensive question mark in terms of the middle of the field, which is the most important part of the field defensively, is that catcher. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that like who you're going to play there, and can Hernandez or Priester or whoever they put back there, Aaron Beatty, like can they adapt to the SEC game quick enough to where you're getting good defense back there? Because those guys have played a combined 0 innings, all four of those guys, 0 innings of SEC catching experience between the four of those guys. So that's big. And Hernandez only started 3 games at catcher last year at Indiana State. So it's just they don't have a lot of catching experience back there. And if you want to talk about like the biggest defensive question mark with this team, it's probably at that catching position at the moment.
Yeah, and it's hard to be a great team without a good defensive catcher. It's possible, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our breakdown of this roster. And like I said, we'll have part 2 of this LSU baseball preview for you on this podcast feed next week. And we'll kind of break down the schedule, the SEC, the rankings, and what our expectations and predictions are for LSU. We mentioned in the Baseball America poll, they're number 2, but guess what? Number 1, number 3, number 4, like number 7 or something are all also SEC teams. So just another year in SEC baseball. But we'll leave things today with this, Koki, and this will kind of launch us into discussion next week. Top to bottom, is this roster more talented than it was last year?
I think it's definitely deeper, and that's just from talking with multiple people and going over the roster myself. And especially, I think they have just a lot more offensive versatility than they did last year. Last year, they were very right-handed heavy. Last year, you can only really rely on, 10 or 11 or maybe 12 guys to contribute. This year, you could put like 14, 15 guys in the lineup and it would be crazy. And then pitching wise, they just have more guys who can go longer and maybe just more guys, period. Maybe you don't want to be relying on so many pitchers who haven't pitched in the SEC before. I think that's kind of a question mark with this team on the pitching side, but they kind of had that issue a little bit last year outside of Luke Holman and Thatcher Hurd. And, they got it together by the end of the year anyway. So, yeah, I would say yes, even though, losing Tommy White, Luke Holman, and Gage Jump and Griffin Herring is no small feat. I mean, those were like 4 of their 7 best players last year, 4 of their 8 best players last year. So that's no small feat. But at the same time, if you get some progress from a guy like Milam, a guy like Larson, a guy like Pearson, or a guy like Jared Jones at the plate, and then you factor in just the amount of like depth that they have on both sides of the ball, really, but especially on the pitching side, I think they are a little bit better on paper than they were last year.
All right. So that will launch us into our discussion next week of maybe a more 10,000-foot view of this 2025 LSU baseball season. But until then, we encourage you to check out our LSU Tigers on NOLA.com YouTube channel. Subscribe to that channel, like this video. Check out in the description, I'm going to post the link to the interview with Jay Johnson. And like I said, we'll probably slip in a basketball podcast at some point early next week and then return with Koki Riley to finish up our LSU baseball preview. Koki, thanks for being here, and we will see you next time. I'm Zach Ewing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.